I don't often get a chance to review light novels that are actually finished. Partly because by the time light novels are fully released in English, no one's still talking about them. And partly because there just aren't that many light novels that are both finished and fully translated into English. Today, I have the rare pleasure of reviewing a light novel that I have read in its entirety. All 25 volumes of it. Ladies and gentlemen, may I present the epic and lengthy adventure that is Mushoku Tensei. The layout of the plot for Mushoku Tensei is odd, to say the least, but here's the general gist of it. Our protagonist, Rudius, is a fat shut-in who gets kicked out of his house when his parents die. Shortly after, he gets squished trying to save some high school students from being run over, and then gets reincarnated in a fantasy world. Oh, but not as a fully functioning adult, but as a baby who really enjoys breastfeeding. Anyways, this story goes from Rudius' rebirth to death, and we get narration from most parts of his life, including right after birth, making this the first story I've read that includes narration from the perspective of a baby. As such, it doesn't exactly have the most consistent pacing and has quite a few time skips, because, well, you really don't want to spend that much time following the story of a baby. Wake up, play with toys, sleep, eat, does not a compelling story make. The first half of this story follows Rudius growing up with no obvious main plot, and the second half sees him desperately striving to protect his family as they are caught up in a conflict between a sadistic god with omniscience and a violent god who can loop through time like Okabe from Steins Gate or Subaru from ReZero. So yeah, once you figure out what the main conflict is, it's actually pretty awesome. It just takes 15 volumes to get there. To be fair, the first half of the story does have a lot going on with learning magic, kidnappings, monster hunting, budding romance, and so on and so forth. The story just really comes into its own in the second half. Rudius is what you'd get if you mixed the protagonist of a harem story with the protagonist of an action shonen story and gave him a brain. All that is to say he's perverted and overpowered, but has enough common sense to be likable. Along with him, we have his father Paul, his mother Zenith, his maid Lilia, his little sisters Aisha and Norn, his teacher Roxy, his childhood friend Sylphie, musclehead friend and tsundere Eris, mentor and savior Rudyard, disciples Zenoba and Julie, Pope Sen and friend Cliff, Princess Ariel, and those are only the characters that have arcs devoted to them. So yeah, the cast of this story is pretty huge. The story tends to go with one set of characters for a couple of volumes and then switch to an entirely new set, with only Rudius staying constant. All these characters do get brought back later though, so things work very well with the author being able to focus on developing one set of characters at a time, while still having them all remain relevant to the story in the long run. I found I had no problem keeping track of all the characters in this cast despite the size, which is a compliment to how well the character development is done. Have you ever read a harem story and thought, why doesn't the protagonist just marry everyone? That would solve so many problems. Well, in this story, that's actually an option. Polygamy is totally a thing in this world, and while not approved by everyone, there are a number of characters that end up with multiple partners, both harem and reverse harem. I have to say that I love that this is a thing because it makes for some really interesting relationship dynamics that I can't say I've ever seen explored in this type of story before. Interestingly, given all the polygamy, the story also places a lot of focus on family. Rudius becomes a young father about halfway through the series, and as we, the readers, watch, he works at raising his kids and taking care of his family. Once again, this is something unique to this, as I've never seen a story in this genre follow a young father with kids as its protagonist, and it's really cool to see things from that perspective. There's some really touching moments both of growth and loss related to this, adding the most emotional depth I've seen from any light novel I've read. Finally, and on a completely different note, I think this story does a great job managing our protagonist's power level in the more action shonen-y parts of the story. If he fights against someone who should be straight up more powerful than him, then he does, actually lose. And when he does win fights, it's often only due to the aid of his allies. It really made me remember how nice it is to watch fights where our protag doesn't have plot armor and can't go to the mathematical impossibility that is 110%. Logic is nice every once in a while. So one problem I definitely see some people having with the story is the switches in style. In a normal story, you'd focus on one period of a person's life, and then end things once you go out of that period. But this story makes an effort to cover our protagonist's whole life. As a result, you get a mix of two very different types of story. Action shonen during the exciting moments of the protagonist's life, and slice of life during the calmer moments. Also, it often has extended periods just of one or the other. Now, This isn't always true, but I find fans of action shonen aren't necessarily the biggest fans of slice of life, and vice versa, so I could see this turning off some people from the story. Other than that, there's also some problems with how morality is dealt with in this story. Along with polygamy, which I already mentioned, our protagonist's reaction to slavery and his dealings with rapists and murderers may raise some eyebrows. To be very clear, our protagonist is fairly moral in his own actions, but he seems to be much more forgiving of certain transgressions than I imagine most people would be. Some of the people Rudius becomes friends with have done some pretty horrific things, and he's surprisingly blasé about it. I can only speak for myself, but I would have liked our protagonist to be just a bit more concerned when he became friends with a man who had previously ripped off his own fiancée's head. There is a certain level of satisfaction I find you only get from finishing epic long stories, and I absolutely got it from Mushoku Tensei. It has all the elements I love from high fantasy, but it's still plenty unique and tells an original story. There are some things that can detract from it, like the fact that it takes half the story to figure out what the main conflict is, or that it has a slightly questionable moral compass, but personally I enjoyed it. As to whether or not I'd recommend it depends on whether you're a fan of both action shonen and slice of life genres. If yes, then absolutely. If no, then maybe if you have enough free time to read 24 books. Anyways, if you've already read the series and are looking for something similar, I would recommend Konosubarashi, which has pretty much the exact same start as Mushoku Tensei. A NEET gets reincarnated in a fantasy world after dying trying to save a high school student from getting run over by a truck. Yeah, as I said, it's pretty darn similar. Konosuba does differ significantly though after Rebirth, as its story is far more focused on comedy and its protagonist is far less competent. Anyways, that's all I have to say for this review. Thank you all for listening. Cheers!